The call came on a Tuesday morning in the middle of February, when the temperature outside the shelter had dropped to 11 degrees, and Carla Reyes was trying to figure out how to stretch $42 and a half-empty jar of peanut butter into a full week of meals for herself and her daughter. She almost did not answer. The number was a Montana area code she did not recognize, and in her experience, unfamiliar numbers meant bill collectors, or worse, social services asking follow-up questions about why a 36-year-old woman and her 8-year-old daughter had been cycling in and out of transitional housing for the better part of 18 months. She almost let it ring. She almost went back to her yellow legal pad where she had been doing math that never added up, subtracting rent deposits from amounts she did not have, saw dividing groceries by days that stretched longer than her budget could reach. She answered because Marisol was watching her from across the cot they shared, those dark, serious eyes tracking every movement her mother made, reading the tension in her shoulders, the way children of struggling parents learn to read weather. And Carla did not want her daughter to see her flinch from a phone call. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Douglas Fenn, attorney at law, calling from a town called Ridgemont in Jefferson County, Montana. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they are about to deliver news they are uncertain will be received as good or bad, news that carries weight in either direction. "Miss Reyes, I represent the estate of your late great-uncle, Hector Dominguez Reyes. He passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 84. I have been attempting to locate you for some time. You have been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate." Carla sat very still on the edge of the cot. She knew the name. Barely. Hector was her father's uncle, the one who had gone west sometime in the 1970s and more or less disappeared from the family's awareness. She remembered him mentioned exactly twice in her childhood. Once by her grandmother, who spoke of him with a mixture of pride and bafflement, saying he was the smart one, the stubborn one, the one who went looking for something and apparently found it. And once by her father, who said Hector was a man who kept his own counsel, which in their family meant he had chosen distance over drama and could not be blamed for it. She had never met him. As far as she knew, no one in her immediate family had seen him in decades. What kind of estate? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A property, Douglas Fenn said. A bunkhouse, and the land it sits on. 48 acres in the mountains outside Ridgemont. There are no outstanding debts. The property transfers free and clear. There is also a travel fund, set aside specifically for you to come and view the property before making any decisions. Carla looked across the room at Marisol, who had gone very still in the way children do when they understand that something important is being decided. A bunkhouse. Yes, ma'am. It is a working structure, older construction, been vacant for several years. I want to be honest with you about the condition. It needs attention. But the land is solid, and the deed is clean, and it belongs to you. The travel fund was $1,200. It arrived as a cashier's check 3 days later, addressed care of the shelter's intake coordinator, a woman named Gloria, who had known Carla for going on 2 years, and who held the envelope out with both hands like it was something fragile. $1,200 was more money than Carla had seen in one place in almost 2 years. She sat with the check for a long time that night, after Marisol was asleep. The shelter quiet around her. The particular nighttime sounds of a place full of people trying not to disturb each other, drifting through the thin walls. She turned the check over in her hands and thought about Hector Dominguez Reyes, a man she had never met, who had apparently spent the last years of his life in the mountains of Montana and had, for reasons she could not yet fathom, decided that she was the person who deserved what he was leaving behind. A bunkhouse. Vacant. Needs attention. Those were not reassuring words. She had learned enough in 18 months of displacement to know that vacant properties needing attention could mean anything from cosmetic repairs to structural disaster, from a livable space requiring work to a condemned shell that would cost more to fix than it was worth. She had no savings, no credit, no safety net. If she drove to Montana and found a ruin, she would have spent the travel money and gained nothing except a longer drive back to nowhere. But she thought about Marisol sleeping 4 feet away with her shoes under her pillow because she had learned, without anyone teaching her, that it was safer to keep your things close. She thought about the way her daughter had stopped mentioning school friends by name sometime around month 3 of their displacement, as though she had already begun to quietly sever ties that could not be maintained without an address. She thought about the morning 3 months ago when Marisol had asked, with no particular accusation in her voice, just honest curiosity, if they were always going to live here. Carla had said no. She had said things were going to change. She had believed it when she said it, and she still believed it. But belief required something to attach itself to, and so far, there had been nothing solid enough to hold the weight. Maybe this was something solid. Maybe. She called her brother Marco the next morning, which in retrospect she would identify as her first mistake. Not because Marco was cruel, not exactly, but because Marco had a talent for making hope sound foolish that he had probably inherited from their father, who had believed in caution above all other virtues and had died cautious and unsurprised by his own modest life. Marco listened to the whole story, and then he was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was organizing his skepticism into something that would sound like concern. "A bunkhouse in Montana," he said. "Carla. Come on. It is 48 acres free and clear, Marco. No mortgage, no debt, just land and a structure, a falling down structure. You said it yourself. It needs work. What are you going to do? Move to the middle of nowhere with Marisol and live in a broken-down barn? It is a bunkhouse, not a barn. You know what I mean. What do you know about Montana? What do you know about property maintenance? You are a hotel housekeeper, or you were until the hotel closed. You are not a carpenter. You are not a rancher. You are not some kind of pioneer woman. I am someone with a chance at having a home, Marco." He softened slightly at that, the edge leaving his voice, replaced by something that might have been genuine worry. "Look, I hear you. I know things have been hard. But this sounds like one of those situations where something looks like an opportunity, and it turns out to be a trap. What if the property has environmental issues? What if there are liens the lawyer does not know about? What if you get up there and it is literally uninhabitable, and you have spent all the travel money, and you have nowhere to go?" "Then I will be in Montana with nowhere to go instead of Texas," she said, which is not actually worse. Her sister Elena was less charitable. Elena had opinions about most things and delivered them with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong in her own estimation. She called Carla back within an hour of Marco presumably telling her, which meant they had been discussing it between themselves first, which meant they had already decided how they felt before Carla had a chance to explain. "I talked to Marco," Elena said, without preamble. "I assumed. Carla, I want you to think carefully about what you are doing. You have an 8-year-old daughter. You are considering uprooting her and driving to a state neither of you has ever been to, based on a phone call from some lawyer you have never met, about a property you have never seen, left by a relative you have never spoken to. That is not an opportunity. That is a recipe for disaster." "He was family," Carla said. "He was a stranger who happened to share blood. That is not the same thing. For all you know, this property is worthless. For all you know, there is some catch the lawyer is not mentioning. Property taxes you will not be able to pay, maintenance costs, liability issues. You could end up worse off than you are now, which, I am sorry to say, is already not great. Carla felt the familiar compression in her chest that her sister's voice reliably produced, the sense of being made smaller, reduced to the sum of her failures and the list of her inadequacies. Elena had a house. Elena had a husband with a steady income, and a car that was paid off, and children who went to good schools and did not keep their shoes under their pillows. Elena had never had to choose between groceries and keeping the phone on. Elena had never slept in a room with 40 other women and their children, listening to the nighttime sounds of shared desperation, trying to keep her daughter from absorbing too much of it. Elena had never needed a lifeline, and therefore did not know what one looked like when it arrived. "I'm going to Montana," Carla said. Silence on the line. Then, "I hope you know what you are doing." "I don't know what I'm doing," Carla said honestly. "But I am going anyway." She told Marisol that evening, sitting on the edge of their shared cot with the map app open on her phone, tracing the route from San Antonio to Ridgemont, Montana. "We are going on a trip," she said. "A long one. We are going to drive to Montana to see a house that your great-great-uncle left us." Marisol looked at the map. "That is very far." "It is. About 28 hours of driving. We will take 3 days. Is it a real house? It is called a bunkhouse, like where cowboys used to sleep on ranches. It is older and it needs some fixing up, but it is on a lot of land in the mountains." Marisol was quiet for a moment, processing this with the methodical seriousness she applied to most things. Then she said, "Are there mountains there, like in the movies?" "Yes, baby, the real ones. Are we going to live there?" Carla folded the map away. "I hope so." Marisol nodded once, as though this was sufficient, and went back to the library book she had been reading, a book about animals that lived in the Arctic, which she had already read twice, and was now reading a third time because there were only so many books available, and she had developed the habit of thorough extraction from limited resources, and another thing she had learned without anyone teaching her. They left on a Thursday morning before the shelter was fully awake, the back of Carla's 2010 Chevy Malibu packed with everything they owned, which filled perhaps half the trunk and the back seat. Clothes in reused grocery bags, a box of Marisol's school things, Carla's certification materials from the hotel training course she had completed the previous spring, before the hotel closed, a laundry bag, 2 sleeping bags rolled tight, a cooler with the food Carla had been quietly setting aside for 3 days, peanut butter, crackers, apples, string cheese, a box of cereal that they would eat dry from the bag. Gloria from the shelter came out to see them off, standing in the parking lot in the pre-dawn gray, with her coat half buttoned, and she pressed a 20 into Carla's hand and said, "You call me when you get there." Carla promised. The drive north and west took them through terrain that shifted with the kind of slow drama that only long distances produce. Texas giving way to Oklahoma, Oklahoma to Kansas, the plains flattening and then rolling, then somewhere in Wyoming beginning to rise toward something more serious, the horizon growing teeth, the sky going wider and more absolute than it had any reason to be. Marisol kept a notebook on her lap and wrote down things she saw, the names of towns on exit signs, descriptions of animals glimpsed in fields, the colors of sky at different times of day. She was methodical about it, her handwriting small and careful, filling the margins with tiny drawings. On the second day, crossing into Montana, Carla pulled off the highway at a rest stop and stood in the cold mountain air and breathed in something that was different from anything she had smelled before, clean and sharp, and carrying the faint resin scent of pine from slopes she could see rising in every direction. Marisol stood beside her, tilting her head back to look at the sky. "Mom." "Yeah. It is bigger here." "Yes. Like it goes farther." Carla understood what she meant. There was something about the Montana sky that was qualitatively different from the sky she was used to. Not just geographically larger, but somehow more present, more assertive. The kind of sky that made you aware of your own smallness in a way that was not frightening, but clarifying. "It does go farther," she said. They reached Ridgemont on the afternoon of the third day. It was smaller than Carla had expected, the kind of town that a person could drive through in 4 minutes at the speed limit and believe they had missed it. A main street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office that appeared to be operating out of a converted house, a feed store, a gas station. Mountains visible in every gap between buildings, rising without apology in all directions. Douglas Fenn's office was above the hardware store, accessible by an exterior staircase that creaked in a way that felt either charming or alarming depending on your mood. He was 60, approximately, with a weathered face and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular unhurried manner of a man who had spent his career in a place where no one was in that much of a rush. He shook Carla's hand, and then knelt down to Marisol's level and shook hers too, started looking at her directly. "You must be Marisol. Your great-great-uncle talked about you, you know." Marisol's eyes went wide. "He knew about me. He knew you existed. He had been following your family's news from a distance for a long time. He was a private man, but he paid attention." He straightened up and gestured them toward the chairs arranged in front of his desk, a desk that held a neat stack of folders and 2 mugs of coffee that had clearly just been poured, suggesting he had been watching for their car. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, settling into his chair and opening the top folder. "The bunkhouse is not in pristine condition. I told you that on the phone, and I want to be honest about what that means before you go out there. The structure is sound, the logs are solid. The roof needs repair in one section, but is not compromised overall. There has been no one living in it for 4 years, since Hector's health deteriorated enough that he moved to town for his last year. So there is dust and some animal intrusion and things that will require significant work. What I want you to understand is the land itself is 48 acres of mountain terrain, well-watered, well-timbered, fully legal, debt-free, and yours." Carla nodded. "What about the property taxes?" Hector set up a prepayment trust covering property taxes for the next 40 years. Carla stared at him. He was a careful man, Fenn said. A planner. He anticipated that whoever came to this property might not have immediate resources, and he wanted to remove as many obstacles as he could. "Why me?" Carla asked. The question she had been carrying since the phone call, the one she had been saving for the moment when she was sitting across from someone who might actually have an answer. Fenn was quiet for a moment. He opened a different folder and removed a letter, which he held rather than immediately passing across the desk. He told me, in one of our conversations about his estate planning, that he had been watching the family from a distance for many years. He said most of what he saw disappointed him, not because people were bad, but because they were careless with each other. He said he saw, more than once, people in his family who needed help and did not get it from the people who should have given it. He paused. He said you were different. He said he had watched you carry things that other people put down. He said he watched you lose things and keep going, and he respected that. He told me, and I am quoting here because I wrote it down at the time, she never stopped trying, and she never stopped being kind, even when the world gave her every reason to do otherwise. He said a person like that deserved a foundation. He slid the letter across the desk. He wrote you this. He asked that you read it privately, when you are ready. Carla took the letter with hands that were steadier than she expected. She folded it and placed it in her jacket pocket, against her heart, which seemed like the right place for it. They signed the papers. The deed transferred to Carla Maria Reyes and her daughter, Marisol Reyes, both names, as Hector had specifically requested. Fenn handed her a key on a wooden fob, that had the initials HDR carved into it, the wood worn smooth by years of handling. "Welcome home, Miss Reyes." The drive out to the property took 40 minutes from town, the last 15 on a gravel road that climbed steadily into the mountains, the pines closing in on both sides, and the sky narrowing to a strip of blue above. Marisol pressed her face to the window and watched the trees scroll past with an expression of concentrated wonder. The gravel road ended at a gate made of weathered timber, padlocked with a lock that Carla's key fit perfectly. Beyond the gate, a rutted track continued another quarter-mile through a meadow gone brown with late winter, and at the end of that track, backed against a slope of pine forest with mountains rising beyond, stood the bunkhouse. It was bigger than she had imagined from the word bunkhouse. 2 stories of rough-hewn timber, dark with age and weather, and the logs fitted with visible precision by someone who had known exactly what they were doing. A wide covered porch ran the full length of the front, its boards weathered silver but structurally intact. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roofline. The section of roof that Fenn had mentioned needing repair was visible on the left side, a dark stain spreading from a corner where something had let go. But the rest of the roof looked sound, the old standing seam, metal still true. Behind the bunkhouse, the land rose in terraces toward the tree line. To the right, a creek was audible before it was visible, the sound of moving water cutting through the stillness. To the left, a weathered outbuilding that might once have been a barn sagged into itself at one corner, but was still mostly standing. Marisol got out of the car first and stood in the meadow grass looking at all of it, turning slowly, taking in the full circle of mountains. "Mom," she said, "look at the mountains. I see them, baby. They are everywhere. They are." She turned back to the bunkhouse with her jaw set and her eyes bright, and she said, "It is ours? It is ours. Then let us see it." The key turned in the bunkhouse door with the heavy click of a quality lock, and the door swung inward on hinges that had been kept oiled. One maintenance detail among what would turn out to be many that Hector had attended to during his periodic visits, right up until he could not manage the road anymore. The interior held the cool, still smell of a space long unoccupied, underlaid with wood and stone, and something herbal that might have been dried sage hung somewhere in the rafters. The main room was large, the full width of the building, with the stone fireplace anchoring the north wall. Handmade furniture still in place, a long table of planed timber, benches along both sides, a set of wooden shelves covering the east wall floor to ceiling. The wood floors were dusty but visibly solid, the boards thick and tight-fitted. High windows on the south side let in the late afternoon light in long bars that caught the dust moving in the disturbed air. Marisol walked to the fireplace and put her hand on the stones, looking up at the mantel where Hector had carved something that she squinted to read. "Mom," she said, "come look." Carla crossed to stand beside her daughter. Carved into the face of the mantel, in letters that had been cut deep and smoothed by someone who intended them to last, were the words, "Lo que se construye con paciencia, no lo deshace la tormenta." What is built with patience, the storm does not undo. Carla stood with her hand on the stones, reading it twice. "He put it in Spanish," Marisol said. "He was family," Carla said. "It is for us." They went through the rest of the space slowly, opening doors, testing floorboards, running water at the hand pump in the kitchen area to see if the well was still active, which it was, cold and clear. The upper floor held 4 bunk rooms, each one with built-in wooden beds, still fitted with old mattresses that would need replacing, and in what was clearly the largest room, the one with the best window, the mountain view framing itself in the glass like something that had been specifically installed for beauty. Behind her they found a narrow writing desk bolted to the wall and a small bookshelf full of books that ranged from engineering manuals to history to a well-thumbed Bible in Spanish. Marisol chose the smallest bunk room without hesitation, the one at the end of the hall with the window that faced east toward the slope. She set her backpack down in the center of the floor and stood in the middle of the small space and turned around once. "This is my room," she said. "It is your room. I am going to put my drawings on this wall. Every one of them." That night, they slept in sleeping bags on the floor of the main room because it was warmer near the fireplace, which Carla had gotten started with wood from the small stack still in the covered bin on the porch, dry and ready as though Hector had left it, knowing someone would need it. Marisol fell asleep within minutes of lying down, her breath evening out in the silence that was not really silence, but rather a different texture of sound than either of them had been used to. The fire, the creek, an owl somewhere in the trees. Carla lay awake and read Hector's letter by firelight. It was 2 pages in a handwriting that was precise and slightly old-fashioned, the letters formed with care. "Carla," he had written, "you don't know me, and I understand why that is. I did not make myself easy to know. I left the family when I was 22 years old because I could see what the family was, and I did not want to become it. And that was a selfish decision that I have had 70 years to reconsider. The selfish part was not the leaving. The selfish part was not going back far enough to help the ones who needed it. And you are one of the ones I should have helped, and I did not, and I am sorry. I have spent 60 years in these mountains, and I have learned things here that I could not have learned anywhere else. I learned that patience is not the same as passivity. I learned that the things you build yourself are worth more than the things that are handed to you. I learned that solitude is different from loneliness, and that you can live alone and still be engaged with the world in ways that matter. I learned in the last years that I had accumulated something worth leaving to someone. I want to tell you about the bunkhouse. I want to tell you what I built there and what I put there, and why I chose the particular arrangements I chose. But I think it is better if you discover it yourself, as I discovered things myself over the years, or through attention and patience and the willingness to look at familiar things until they become unfamiliar again. What I will tell you is this: do not be in a hurry. The land will provide for you if you let it, but it requires time to understand. Give it time. Give yourself time. Do not listen to the people who will tell you that you have made a mistake. They told me I had made a mistake, and I did not, and neither have you. The bunkhouse has things in it that I have not told Douglas Fenn about, because what I have put there is for you, and not for legal processes. Explore carefully. Be thorough. Pay attention to the things that seem odd or out of place. I have left you a foundation. What you build on it is yours. I am proud of you for coming. Most people would not have. The ones who dismissed this before you even arrived are the ones who were never going to understand what it is worth. With respect and with hope, your great-great-uncle Hector. Carla folded the letter and held it in both hands for a long time, looking at the fire. He had not told Douglas Fenn. That sentence had a weight to it, a specific gravity that she felt without yet understanding. There were things in the bunkhouse that Hector had not told his attorney, things meant to be discovered, things left for her. She looked around the main room in the firelight, at the shelves and the furniture, and the shadows at the edges of the room where the firelight did not reach, and she felt something shift in her chest, a slow, careful unfurling of something she had kept very small and protected for 18 months. She would look carefully, and she would be thorough. She would pay attention to the things that seemed odd. Morning in the mountains arrived with a clarity that Carla had not been prepared for. The light came first through the east windows of the upper floor, spilling down the stairs and across the main room in long, flat lines. And with it came cold, the fire having burned down overnight, and Marisol's voice from the loft, calling that she could see the mountains from her window, and they had snow on them, and was that allowed in this season? It is allowed in every season up here, Carla called back, pulling herself out of the sleeping bag and finding her jacket. They ate crackers and peanut butter for breakfast, which Marisol accepted without comment, because she had learned not to comment on food. And then they began their first full day in the bunkhouse with the shared understanding that there was work to do, and that work was its own kind of good news. Carla had called Gloria from the shelter the night before to say they had arrived safely. She had called Douglas Fenn to let him know they were settled in. She had not called Marco or Elena. They had not called her, which she took note of without particular bitterness, simply as information about where she stood in the ledger of her family's attention. The first days established a rhythm. Mornings began with the fire and water from the pump and what food they had, which Carla supplemented with 2 trips to the general store in Ridgemont, spending carefully from what remained of the travel money. A woman named Pat, who ran the store, asked where they were staying, and when Carla said the old Reyes bunkhouse up past the gate on Copper Creek Road, Pat's eyebrows went up and she said, "Hector Reyes's place. You related?" "He was my great-uncle." Pat looked at her for a moment with an expression that Carla could not quite read, then said, "He was a good man. A quiet man, but good. Came in here every few weeks until the last year, always bought the same things. Never made trouble. Never asked for anything extra. You let me know if you need anything." It was the first of what would turn out to be many such moments, Ridgemont gradually making itself known as a place where Hector was remembered, with something close to respect, and that respect extending to Carla by association in the understated way of small mountain towns, which did not announce their community, but demonstrated it through small, consistent actions. The repairs required were significant, but not overwhelming. Carla had learned things in 18 months of necessity, some of them practical, and she had her nursing school training in the way of organized problem-solving, the habit of assessment before action. She walked the perimeter of the bunkhouse, noting every issue. She climbed to the roof, via a ladder she found in the outbuilding, and assessed the damaged section, which turned out to be a failed seal at a chimney, flashing rather than structural failure of the metal itself, repairable with materials from the hardware store below Douglas Fenn's office. Marisol became her assistant, holding things, passing tools, carrying measurements written in the notebook she now used for everything. They worked through the main room first, cleaning away the animal nesting in 2 of the kitchen cabinets, patching the single broken window with plastic sheeting until proper glazing was available, clearing the chimney flue with a brush that Carla made from a bundle of pine branches and rope. The fireplace, once cleaned, drew beautifully, Hector having built it with a mason's understanding of draft and airflow. She found the first odd thing on the 5th day. She had been moving the long wooden shelves on the east wall to clean behind them, and when she pulled the 3rd section away from the wall, she noticed that the wall behind it was not the same as the rest of the wall. The bunkhouse walls were rough-hewn logs, the spaces between chinked with what appeared to be a dried mortar compound, the surface uneven and organic. The section of wall behind the 3rd shelf unit was smooth, not plaster, but smooth stone, carefully fitted, a different material entirely than what surrounded it, and it extended from floor to ceiling, approximately 4 feet wide. She stood looking at it for a moment. Pay attention to the things that seem odd or out of place. She ran her hands over the surface. The stones were the same river rock that formed the fireplace, fitted with the same precision, the mortar between them the same color and texture. It was clearly Hector's work. It was clearly intentional. And it was, equally clearly, not just a wall. Marisol appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. "What are you doing?" "Come look at this." Marisol came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the stone section behind the shelf. "That is different from the rest," Marisol said immediately. "I know. Why would he use different material just for that part? I do not know yet." Marisol put her hand flat against the stones, the same way she had put her hand on the fireplace mantel on their first day. She pressed experimentally at different points along the surface. At the third point she tried, low on the left side, near the floor. There was a faint hollow sound beneath her palm, rather than the solid resistance of the rest. "Mom, this part sounds different." Carla knelt beside her. She pressed her palm against the same spot and heard it too, a faint resonance that suggested space behind rather than solid fill. They spent an hour on careful examination, running their hands over every inch of the stone section, pressing, tapping, listening. The hollow sound was concentrated in a roughly 2-foot square area near the lower left corner. Around the edges of that area, if you looked very closely, there was a slight irregularity in the mortar lines, a seam that was fractionally different in color from the mortar around it, as though it had been applied later, or removed and replaced. "It is a door," Marisol said. Carla did not say yes or no. She said, "Let me get the tools." The chisel and hammer from Hector's workshop in the outbuilding were quality tools, old but maintained. Carla worked carefully along the seam she had identified, applying pressure at the edges, feeling for the mechanism. It took another 30 minutes of patient work before she found it. 2 stones near the upper right corner of the section that moved, not in or out, but sideways, and rotating on a hidden pivot to release a catch somewhere inside the wall. The section swung outward, not a small panel, but the entire 4-foot wide, floor-to-ceiling stone section, pivoting on a mechanism concealed in the floor and ceiling, swinging with the smooth inevitability of something precisely engineered. Behind it was darkness, and the cool exhalation of underground air, and stone stairs leading down. Carla stood at the top of the stairs with her flashlight in her hand, and felt the particular quality of silence that comes from a space that has been undisturbed for a long time. A waiting silence, a held-breath silence. She thought about Hector's letter. "I have left you a foundation. What you build on it is yours." She thought about Marisol, 8 years old, almost standing beside her, with her notebook pressed to her chest and her eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but was the predecessor to wonder. "Are we going down?" Marisol asked. "We are going down," Carla said. The stairs were stone, 12 of them, cut directly into bedrock with the same careful hand that had shaped everything else Hector had made. They ended in a chamber. Carla's flashlight swept the space, and she took in what she was seeing in stages, because the mind does not accept the full picture all at once when the full picture is too far outside the range of expected experience. The chamber was approximately 30 feet wide and 40 feet long, the ceiling vaulted and supported by timber beams that had been shaped by hand. The walls were smooth stone, worked with evident care. And along those walls, and arranged with the meticulous organization that characterized everything Hector had built above ground, were shelves, dozens of them, floor to ceiling, constructed of heavy timber bolted to the stone, holding objects and containers and locked cases in arrangements that were clearly the product of decades of deliberate accumulation. In the center of the chamber, on a platform of fitted stone, sat a desk, and on the desk, aligned with precise intention, lay a leather-bound journal. Carla crossed the chamber slowly, her flashlight moving across the shelves, catching the gleam of things she could not yet identify in the peripheral sweep. Objects behind glass, the dull, heavy glow of metal, the flat, careful rectangles of what might have been paintings wrapped in protective covering. And she reached the desk and stood before it, and looked down at the journal. On its cover, in Hector's precise hand, a single line. Para Carla y Marisol. For Carla and Marisol. Beneath that line, a second. Comenzado el 3 de enero de 1961. Completado el 14 de septiembre de 2019. Begun January 3, 1961. Completed September 14, 2019. 58 years. He had been building this for 58 years. Marisol stood beside her, and Carla felt her daughter's small hand find hers in the dark, and she held it, and she opened the journal to the first page. His handwriting in the early entries was the handwriting of a young man, slightly less controlled than the letter she had received, the letters of someone still becoming what he would eventually be. The entries began in 1961, 2 years before Hector would have purchased the bunkhouse, which meant he had been planning this before he had a place to put it. The first entries were brief, almost telegraphic. January 3, 1961. First acquisition. 14 St. Gaudens Double Eagles, 1909s. Purchased from estate sale in Denver. $47. Condition: uncirculated. Current numismatic value unknown but significant. Holding. Carla read it twice. Then she looked up at the shelves. Marisol was already moving along the nearest shelf, her flashlight tracing across the locked cases and containers, reading labels in Hector's hand, numbers and dates, descriptors she could not yet parse. "Mom," she said from 3 feet away, her voice carrying the particular quality of a child who has decided to be very calm about something that requires calm. "Mom, what is a St. Gaudens?" "It is a gold coin," Carla said. "An American gold coin. Very valuable." Marisol turned. How valuable. Carla's mouth was dry. She cleared her throat. "Very," she said. She turned back to the journal. The entries continued across the decades in the same methodical style, each acquisition noted with date, source, price paid, and a brief description. The journal was organized not chronologically but by category, each section tabbed with a strip of leather. Numismatics, metallics, fine art, rare documents, instruments. She turned to the final pages, where Hector's handwriting had become slightly larger, the hand of a very old man, still precise, but larger, and found what she was looking for. Final valuation summary, he had written. September 14, 2019. Completed with the assistance of 3 independent appraisers working under confidentiality agreements. Below that, a table. Each category listed with a valuation range. Numismatic collection, gold and silver coinage, spanning 1790 to 1935. Estimated value, $47 million to $52 million. Metallics, gold bullion and silver bullion, held in cast bars. Estimated value, $61 million to $68 million. Fine art, 17 works spanning 1840 to 1920, including 3 works of significant attribution. Estimated value, $89 million to $112 million. Rare documents, including 2 items of exceptional provenance. Estimated value, $22 million to $28 million. Scientific instruments, chronometers, and navigational equipment spanning 1780 to 1890. Estimated value, $11 million to $14 million. Miscellaneous holdings. Estimated value, $6 million to $9 million. Total estimated value, conservative projection, $236 million. Total estimated value, upper projection, $283 million. Midpoint estimate, $259 million. I have rounded down throughout, Hector had written beneath the table. I prefer to underestimate so as not to create false expectations. The gold alone, at current market, likely exceeds my projections. Below this, in the careful formal hand, he reserved for things he wanted to be understood clearly. This is yours, Carla. Yours and Marisol's. Built over 58 years of patience and intention. Every object was acquired legally. Every acquisition is documented with provenance. Douglas Fenn does not know the contents of this vault, only that you should be given the property and time to understand what it holds. When you are ready, contact the attorneys I have noted at the back of this journal. They specialize in estates of this nature. Do not contact anyone else first. Not family members. Not financial advisors you do not know. Trust the process, trust the documentation, and trust yourself. The people who told you that you were making a mistake will tell you something different now. You do not owe them anything except the dignity of not celebrating in front of them. You earned this not by blood, but by being the kind of person who deserved it. I watched you carry what you were given and still try to give more. That is the only qualification that mattered to me. Use it well. Use it patiently. Build things that last. Con todo mi respeto y mi esperanza. With all my respect and my hope. Hector Dominguez Reyes. Carla sat down on the stone floor of the chamber because her legs had decided they needed a rest. She sat with the journal open in her lap and the flashlight held loose in one hand and her back against the edge of the desk. Marisol came and sat beside her, pressing close, the way she had always pressed close in the difficult moments. Physical certainty offered when words were not enough. They sat in the cool underground dark for a long time, mother and daughter, in a space that had been waiting for them for 58 years. Eventually, Marisol said, quietly, in the voice she used when she was thinking something through. He spent his whole life building this. He did. For us. For someone like us. He did not know exactly who yet. He knew enough. Carla put her arm around her daughter and looked at the shelves, at the locked cases, and the wrapped paintings, and the dark shapes of things that were worth more than she had the immediate capacity to process. Outside, the mountains stood in their February silence, the creek running over stone, the pines holding their cold green weight, the same mountains that had been there when Hector was young and would be there long after everyone in this room was gone. He had understood something that took most people a lifetime to fail to learn, that patience was not waiting. Patience was building. Every day that most people spent consuming, Hector had spent accumulating, not out of greed, but out of a philosophy she was beginning to understand from the inside. The belief that what you built with intention and care would outlast everything that was merely handed to you. She had spent 18 months believing she was at the end of something. She had been at the beginning of this. She had spent 18 months trying to give Marisol stability and failing by every conventional measure. She had, without knowing it, been on her way to the only foundation solid enough to hold what her daughter deserved. The next morning, Carla called the number at the back of the journal. A firm in Helena, specialists in high-value estates. The attorney who answered, a woman named Christine Bell, was clearly familiar with Hector Reyes' name. Though she had clearly been waiting for years for this call, she did not express surprise. She expressed, if anything, relief. "Miss Reyes," she said, I am so glad you found the journal. We have been holding certain documentation for your arrival. When can you come in?" Carla looked around the main room of the bunkhouse, at the stone fireplace with its carved instruction, at the repaired windows letting in the mountain light, at Marisol sitting at the long table with her notebook, drawing something Carla could not see from this angle. She looked at the place where the stone section of wall had swung open 2 days ago and was now standing closed again, looking like nothing more than a variation in the building material, invisible to anyone who did not already know. "I need a few days," she said. "I need to be steady before I am ready for what comes next." "Take the time you need," Christine Bell said. "The documentation has waited this long. It will wait a little longer." After she hung up the phone, Carla went to the porch and stood in the mountain air, which was cold and sharp and smelled of pine and of the creek somewhere below the meadow. She thought about Marco, who had said this was a trap. She thought about Elena, who had asked if she knew what she was doing. She thought about the shelter and the parking lots and the nights she had spent doing math that never added up. She thought about a man she had never met, who had spent 60 years building something, and then looked across the decades at a family he had mostly kept his distance from, and chosen her. And she thought about why he had chosen her, not because she was smart enough or skilled enough or in any way prepared, but because he had seen her carry things and keep going, and he had decided that was worth protecting. She was not ready yet for what was coming. She knew that. There would be legal processes and appraisers and decisions she could not yet imagine needing to make. There would be her family, who would hear what had been found and would reappear with explanations and adjustments to their previous positions. There would be people who would want things from her, people who would try to tell her she was not capable of managing what Hector had left. She was not ready for any of that. But she was ready for this: the porch and the mountains and the cold, clean air and Marisol inside at the table, drawing in a building that was theirs, on land that was theirs, in a place that no one could take from them. She was ready for that. She stood on the porch until the cold drove her back inside, and then she sat down beside her daughter and looked at what she was drawing. It was the bunkhouse, rendered in the careful lines of Marisol's precise hand, the mountains behind it, the creek suggested at the lower edge, and in front of the door, 2 figures holding hands. "What are you going to title it?" Carla asked. Marisol printed the letters at the bottom of the page without hesitation, as though she had already decided. "Home," she wrote. Finally. The attorneys in Helena worked out of a building that had once been a bank, the original vault door still visible through a glass partition in the back wall, which Carla noticed and considered briefly as she settled into the chair across from Christine Bell's desk. There was something fitting about it, a vault inside a building that used to hold other people's money. Her family had always joked, without much affection, that the Reyes women had no luck with banks. The money went in and did not come back out. Carla thought about telling Christine Bell this, then decided it was not the kind of thing you said in your first meeting with an attorney who was about to manage the legal architecture of $259 million. Christine Bell was 52, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain, and the quiet, load-bearing competence of someone who had spent 30 years handling situations that most people never encountered. She had a second attorney in the room, a younger man named Paul Okafor, who specialized in tax law, and a third person Carla had not expected, a woman named Renata Voss from a firm in New York that dealt specifically in fine art authentication and estate valuation. We have been holding documentation since 2019, Christine Bell said, placing a folder on the desk between them. When Hector completed his final accounting, he sent us sealed copies of all provenance documentation for every item in the vault, along with instructions for managing the estate once his heir was located and verified. He was very thorough. He was very thorough about everything, Carla said. Christine allowed the small smile that this earned. Yes, he was. She opened the folder. "What I want you to understand before anything else, Miss Reyes, is that you are under no time pressure. Nothing about this situation requires rapid decisions. The vault is secure, the documentation is in order, and your legal standing as sole beneficiary is not in question. What we need to do now is make sure you are protected before anything becomes public." Before, Carla said, understanding the weight of that word. Before. Because once this becomes known, and it will become known, you will have people approaching you from multiple directions. Some of them will be legitimate professionals with genuine expertise. Some of them will be family members, with revised opinions about the quality of your decision-making. Christine's tone was neutral and precise. We want you to have your legal structure established, your assets properly secured, and your decision-making framework in place before any of that begins. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense. Paul Okafor walked her through the tax implications with the patient efficiency of someone who had explained complex financial concepts to people in states of shock many times before. The estate transfer itself had specific tax treatment. The individual categories of assets, coins, bullion, art, documents, each had different treatment at the point of sale. There were structures available that would protect a substantial portion from immediate taxation while maintaining full legal compliance. There was, he said, no need to sell anything quickly. Hector's trust had covered not just property taxes, but also the operational costs of maintaining the vault in its current state for another 15 years. They had time. Renata Voss spoke about the art. 17 works spanning 1840 to 1920, 3 of them significant enough that she had been waiting since 2019 to run proper authentication analysis. Hector's documentation was exceptionally strong, she said. Provenance chains that most collectors spent careers trying to assemble. But authentication required physical examination, and she would need access to the vault. Carla told them she would arrange access the following week. She drove back to the bunkhouse in the early afternoon, the mountains throwing long shadows across the road, and sat for a moment in the parked car before going inside, looking at the building that 2 weeks ago had been a word in a phone call and was now the fixed center of everything. The roof repair was half finished, the new flashing installed, the old section sealed. The porch boards Carla had replaced on day 3 showed lighter wood against the weathered silver of the originals, a visible record of the work they had done. Marisol was on the porch with her notebook and a mug of hot chocolate made from the tin of cocoa powder they had bought at Pat's store. How was the city? Big enough, Carla said, come on climbing the steps and sitting in the other chair. The lawyers are good. They know what they are doing. Did they say how much everything is worth? Hector's estimate was around $259 million. They think it might be more once the art is properly authenticated. Marisol was quiet for a moment, writing something in her notebook. Then she said, "What does $259 million feel like?" Carla thought about it honestly. "It feels the same as yesterday," she said. "But I think that will change. Is that okay?" "I think it has to be okay. I think you have to let it change slowly, or it breaks something." Marisol nodded as though this was satisfactory and went back to her notebook. They had exactly 9 more days of quiet. The quiet ended not because Carla told anyone, but because small towns operate on information networks that have nothing to do with deliberate disclosure. A woman at the Helena legal firm mentioned to her neighbor that she had been working on an unusual estate case. The neighbor worked at the county recorder's office and had processed the deed transfer and noticed the address. Pat at the general store had told her cousin in Missoula that Hector Reyes's great-niece had come from Texas and seemed like good people. Douglas Fenn had mentioned to the pharmacist, while picking up a prescription, that the Reyes estate had been successfully transferred to a young woman and her daughter. Each piece of information was innocent on its own. Together, they formed a shape. The regional newspaper in Helena ran a 4-paragraph story on a Wednesday. The headline was modest. "Texas woman inherits Montana mountain property from reclusive great-uncle." The story contained no specifics about value, because no one they interviewed knew any specifics, but it mentioned that the estate had been in legal preparation since 2019, and that Hector Reyes had been a long-time resident of Jefferson County, known for his privacy and his careful habits. By Thursday morning, The story had been picked up by a wire service. By Thursday afternoon, Carla's phone had received 11 calls from numbers she did not recognize and 3 voicemail messages, 2 from journalists and 1 from a man who identified himself as a financial advisor from Dallas, who specialized in sudden wealth management and wanted to schedule a consultation at her earliest convenience. By Thursday evening, Marco had called. She was in the main room when the phone rang with his number, and she stood for a moment looking at it, feeling the specific quality of what was about to happen, the particular combination of obligation and weariness that family produces in people who have been disappointed by it enough times to recognize the pattern. She answered. Carla. He said her name the way people say names when they are trying to project calm over something that is not calm at all. I saw the story online, about the inheritance. There is not much to the story, she said. It is pretty thin on detail. The story says you inherited property from Hector Reyes, Dad's Uncle Hector. That is what it says, yes. A beat of silence. I should have been more supportive when you first told me about the phone call. I said some things that I think were not fair. Carla said nothing. I was worried about you, he said. I am always worried about you, and sometimes that comes out wrong. It comes out like you think I am incapable, Marco. I know. He paused. Look, Elena and I have been talking. We think it would make sense for one of us to come up there, to help, to look at the situation and make sure you are handling everything properly. We are family, Carla, and something this significant, you should not be navigating it alone. She had known this was coming. Hector had known this was coming. He had written about it with the calm certainty of someone who had observed her family from a distance for 60 years and understood its mechanics better than the people inside it did. I am not navigating it alone, she said. I have legal counsel. I have specialists. I am doing this correctly and carefully. Professional counsel is not the same as family. No, she said, it is not. Professional counsel does not take $42 from me when I am living in a shelter and tell me it is a loan and then stop returning my calls. The silence that followed was longer. That was years ago, Marco said finally. It was 14 months ago. I have the text messages. Look, we made mistakes. We are trying to make it right. We want to be there for you. She thought about what Christine Bell had said. We want you to have your legal structure established before any of that begins. I will call you when I am ready to talk, she said. I am not ready yet. She ended the call, set the phone on the table, and looked at Marisol, who was pretending to read a book in the chair by the window, but whose eyes had not moved on the page in 3 minutes. Uncle Marco? Yes. And Aunt Elena? Probably next. Elena called the following morning. Her tone was different from Marco's, less conciliatory and more businesslike, which was in many ways more honest. Elena did not bother with extended preamble. I need to understand what we are dealing with here, Carla. The newspaper story is vague, and I want facts. You do not need facts about my inheritance, Elena. As your sister, I have an interest in your well-being and in this family's future. If Hector left you something significant, then decisions you make will affect all of us. I have a real estate background. I understand property and asset management. You need someone who can assess this situation practically and not emotionally. You think I am being emotional. Well, I think you are in a very small mountain town with an 8-year-old daughter and lawyers you have known for 3 weeks, and you are making decisions that will affect the rest of your life. Yes, I think you could benefit from additional perspective. What Elena meant, translated from the careful language of self-interest into plain speech, was, I believe there is money here, and I want to establish proximity to it before the architecture is completed. Carla had learned to speak this language in the hardest school available, and she was fluent. I have additional perspective, she said. I have excellent legal counsel, a tax specialist, and an art authentication expert who has been working with this estate for 6 years. What I do not need is someone who told me I was making a mistake 2 weeks ago and now wants to be useful." The way Elena's voice changed at that was instructive. The businesslike tone dropped, and something harder came through, the frustration of a person who has been outmaneuvered on the first move. "This is not about what I said 2 weeks ago. It is partly about what you said 2 weeks ago," Carla said. "It is also about the 14 months before that, when you knew I was in a shelter and you did not call. It is about all of that. I am not saying this to be unkind. I am saying it because I need you to understand that the door to being involved in my decisions is not going to be opened by urgency now when it was closed by indifference before." She heard Elena inhale sharply. "You are being very hard," Elena said. "I'm being very clear," Carla said. "There is a difference. I will call you when I am ready." She ended that call too, and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, feeling the particular exhaustion of having to be strong in ways that should not have been necessary. There was a grief in it that she had not expected, not because she was surprised that Marco and Elena were behaving this way, but because she had hoped, even now, even after everything, that they might not. That the sight of her and Marisol surviving something this improbable might produce something other than the reflex to acquire a position near the new wealth. Hope was a habit she apparently could not break. Marisol appeared from upstairs with her notebook, sat across from her mother at the long table, and opened to a fresh page. She dated the top of the page and then wrote in her careful small letters, "Day 14. The calls have started." She looked up at Carla. I'm documenting everything," she said. "Like Hector did in the journal. I think it is important to have a record." Carla looked at her daughter, this child who had been keeping her own counsel and drawing her own conclusions and deciding independently to document the situation because she understood, without being taught, that what gets written down persists. 8 years old, and more methodical than most adults, Carla knew. "That is exactly right," she said. "Write it all down." Christine Bell was unsurprised when Carla reported the family contact. She had seen this pattern in every high-value estate transfer she had managed. The speed and the framing varied, but the substance was always the same. The people who had been absent reappeared, and the people who had been dismissive revised their position, and the language of concern was deployed like a tool. The legal protection they built over the following 2 weeks was careful and layered. A trust structure that placed all inherited assets under management with Carla as sole trustee, Marisol named as successor trustee upon adulthood, no provision for any other party to access or influence the trust without Carla's explicit written authorization. A formal protocol for all family contact to be routed through the legal firm if Carla chose, a restraining architecture that did not require use but existed if needed. Paul Okafor structured the tax treatment with a precision that preserved a significant portion from immediate liability. So he spent 3 afternoons at the bunkhouse table with Carla, walking her through each category of assets, explaining the implications of different disposition strategies, making sure she understood not just what was happening, but why. Because he was the kind of professional who believed his clients should be able to make real decisions rather than simply ratifying what they were told. Renata Voss arrived at the bunkhouse on a Thursday with a case of equipment and 2 assistants, and they spent 2 days in the vault conducting the physical examination of the 17 artworks. Carla watched from the desk in the corner, learning to read the language of authentication, the way Renata moved through the examination with methodical care, the measurements and ultraviolet illumination and canvas analysis, so the cross-referencing of physical characteristics against provenance documentation. The 3 works of significant attribution turned out to be 4, Renata had suspected a fourth from Hector's documentation notes, and the physical examination confirmed it. A small landscape, oil on panel, acquired by Hector in 1973 from an estate sale in Billings for $300, was a work by a significant American painter whose output was smaller than commonly believed, and whose known catalog had 3 works currently unaccounted for in the standard reference texts. This one alone, Renata said carefully, will require independent authentication from 2 additional specialists. But my assessment is that it is genuine and that it fills one of the gaps in the known catalog. At current auction estimates for comparable works by this artist, now we are looking at somewhere between 18 and 24 million. For $300 in 1973, Carla said. Renata looked at her with an expression that contained professional respect and something warmer. Your great-uncle had remarkable instincts. I have been doing this for 25 years, and the quality of his acquisitions, across every category, is extraordinary. He did not collect randomly. Every piece he acquired was selected with specific knowledge and specific intention. He built this over 58 years, Carla said. I know. He sent us his journal pages in 2019, the ones covering his collecting methodology. He wrote that the goal was never to accumulate wealth for its own sake, but to preserve things that deserved preservation, and to build something that could not be easily disaggregated or dissipated. He specifically said, in the notes, that he wanted to create something that would be hard to steal. Hard to steal. He was thinking about people who might want to take it, Renata said. People who would prefer to dissolve it into manageable pieces and distribute the proceeds rather than let it sit intact as a coherent entity with its own weight and gravity. He wanted it to be too significant to be easily broken apart. Carla thought about Marco and Elena. She thought about the sequence of phone calls that had come in over the past 2 weeks, the gradual escalation from careful concern to thinly veiled urgency. She thought about Hector, in his solitude, observing from a distance and planning with the long-game clarity of someone who was building not just assets, but defenses. He had been right to plan for this. The revised valuation came in the last week of March, after Renata's preliminary authentication reports had been incorporated, and Paul Okafor had updated his calculations based on current metal prices. Christine Bell called Carla on a morning when the snowpack was beginning to soften at the lower elevations, and the creek was running with the particular energy of spring melt, audible from the porch. The updated figures, Christine said, working from conservative estimates, show a total value of approximately $281 million. With the 4th authenticated painting incorporated at the lower end of its range, that number rises to approximately $299 million. If the full authentication bears out at the upper estimate, we are looking at $319 million, potentially slightly above. Carla was standing on the porch when she received this call, watching the meadow, where the brown of winter grass was beginning to show the first thin green of new growth. $319 million. She said it out loud, quietly, not because she needed to hear it, but because it seemed like the kind of number that should be spoken aloud at least once to make it real. $319 million in a vault under a bunkhouse in Montana, built by a man she had never met, left to her because he had decided she was the right person to have it. What happens now? She asked. Christine Bell walked her through the next steps. Formal completion of authentication, establishment of sale processes for the assets that Carla decided to liquidate, strategies for the assets she chose to retain, questions about how much to sell and how quickly, about what to do with the proceeds, about what the transition from this life to the next one was going to look like in practical terms. There is no hurry, Christine said again. I keep waiting to feel differently, Carla said. I keep waiting for it to feel real. It will, Christine said. Usually, it happens when you do something ordinary, and then realize you do not have to worry about it. You buy groceries, and you are not counting. You fill the gas tank and you do not check the price. It is not a dramatic moment. It is a small one. She was right. The moment came 4 days later when Marisol needed new shoes because the ones she had been wearing since the previous fall had finally given out entirely, the sole beginning to separate at the toe. And Carla took her to the small shoe store in Ridgemont, and Marisol found a pair she liked, and Carla bought them without looking at the price tag. She bought them and carried them to the car and strapped Marisol in, and then sat in the driver's seat for a moment, because the simplicity of it, the absolute ordinary simplicity of buying her daughter shoes without anguish, was the thing that broke the seal on everything she had been holding. She cried for approximately 4 minutes, quietly facing forward, and then she started the car. "Mom," Marisol said from the back seat, "I am okay. I am happy. You cry when you are happy sometimes. I cry when things stop being hard," Carla said. "That is a different kind of crying." Marisol considered this. "I think I understand," she said, and looked out the window at the mountains. Elena arrived on a Friday without calling first, which was the kind of move that contained its own message. She appeared in a rental car on the gravel road, parking outside the gate because she had not been given the code, and she called Carla's cell phone from 50 feet away and said, "I am here. I drove up from Billings. I wanted to see you." Carla stood at the gate and looked at her sister through the car window and felt the complicated weight of years of shared history, the parts that were love and the parts that were harm and the parts that were simply the texture of having grown up alongside someone who became a different person than you expected. She opened the gate. Elena had dressed for a different Montana than the one she was in. Sensible heels that were immediately wrong on the gravel track. A coat that was stylish rather than warm. The instincts of a woman used to managing impressions in environments she controlled. She looked at the bunkhouse for a long moment before speaking. "It is bigger than I expected," she said. "Hector built it himself." Elena nodded, as though receiving information she would later evaluate. She looked at Carla with an expression that was doing several things at once, presenting concern while also assessing, showing warmth while also cataloging. Carla recognized the expression because she had seen it before, on real estate agents and loan officers, and everyone who had ever needed something from her while pretending to offer something first. "Can we talk inside?" They sat at the long table with coffee, Marisol at the far end drawing, close enough to be present, far enough to offer the suggestion of privacy. Elena looked around the main room, at the fireplace, and the repaired windows, and the shelves. "You have done a lot of work here. We have been here 5 weeks. It looks good. It looks livable." Elena paused. "Carla, I want to apologize. I said things when you called that were unkind, and I have been thinking about them, and I was wrong." "Thank you," Carla said, meaning it, because she believed Elena had convinced herself this was true. "I want to be honest with you. I know there is money. I know the estate is worth something significant. I am not going to pretend I do not know that. What I want to say is that regardless of the money, I am your sister, and I have not been a good one, and I would like to try to change that." It was a better speech than Carla had expected. It had the shape of honesty, the bones of genuine acknowledgement. She sat with it for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. "I believe you mean that," she said. "I do. I also believe that you would not have driven to Montana if the newspaper story had said I inherited 48 acres and a bunkhouse with no assets inside." Elena's jaw tightened slightly. "That might be true," she said finally. "I am not certain it is not true. But I am here now." "You are here now," Carla agreed. She looked at her sister across the table. I am not going to share the estate with you, Elena. Not with you, not with Marco. It is mine and Marisol's, and it is legally structured so that it cannot be accessed by anyone else. I need you to understand that clearly before we talk about anything else, because I do not want there to be a conversation running underneath the conversation we are having. The silence that fell was significant. Elena looked down at her coffee. Hector left it to me specifically, Carla continued. He left it to me because he had been watching our family for decades, and he made a decision about who deserved it. That decision is not subject to revision by anyone, including the people who did not benefit from it. I am willing to have a relationship with you, Elena. I would like to have a relationship with you. But it has to be a relationship, not a negotiation. Elena looked up. She looked for a moment genuinely uncomfortable, which was its own kind of honesty. I hear you, she said. Good. Is there room for me to stay tonight? Carla considered her sister's face, the specific mixture of calculation and something more vulnerable underneath it, and thought about what it meant to be a person who was trying to be better and had not yet fully learned how. Yes, she said. There is room. The conversation that night over dinner was awkward in the way that honest conversations between people with complicated histories are awkward, full of pauses and careful word choices, and moments when one person said something that landed wrong and had to be picked apart and reassembled. But it was real. Elena told Carla things about her own marriage that she had not told anyone, about the years that had been harder than she presented to the world. Carla told Elena things about the shelter that she had not told anyone, about the particular quality of shame that came from having nothing, and the way it reshaped how you saw yourself. Marisol fell asleep at the table during the middle of it, her head on her arms, her notebook open beside her, and Carla carried her upstairs and tucked her in and stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for a moment, looking at the drawings on the wall, 8 of them now, all the houses and mountains and figures holding hands, a record of hope maintained through the time when hope was the only thing they had. When she came back downstairs, Elena was washing the dishes. It was a small thing. It was also not small. The next phase came quickly. The news coverage expanded in the way that news coverage expands when the initial story contains enough gaps to invite speculation. A journalist in Helena filed a longer piece, this one drawing on interviews with people in Ridgemont who knew Hector, so when the story that emerged was genuinely compelling. A man who had left his family and built something alone in the mountains over 60 years, and then left it to a great niece he had never met, a woman who had been homeless when the letter found her. That detail, the homelessness, was the one that caught. The image of Carla and Marisol in a shelter, the callousness of the family call from attorney Douglas Fenn, finding the travel check for $1,200 in Gloria's hands, the 3-day drive north, the bunkhouse in the mountains. These were the elements that turned a real estate story into something people wanted to read and share and talk about. By the second week of the coverage, the number had appeared. Not the exact number, but a number. A source the reporters would not name, who had been tangentially aware of the estate's scope, describing it as potentially in the hundreds of millions. The story doubled in reach, then doubled again. The calls to her cell phone had been manageable before. After the expanded coverage, they became unmanageable. Financial advisors and investment managers and real estate developers, and 2 separate people who wanted to option the story for television, and a man from Arizona who claimed he had information proving that the estate rightfully included property that Hector had purchased in 1981 and never properly deeded, and that he had a claim to it. Christine Bell's firm took over managing communications. Carla's cell number changed. Access to her went through the legal team, and the legal team was experienced at this particular kind of traffic. What Carla had not anticipated though she should have, was the approach that came from outside the family, but used the family as its instrument. A man named Gerald Castillo arrived in Ridgemont in the third week of the coverage. He had no obvious connection to Carla or to Hector, and he did not approach Carla directly. He approached Marco. Carla only learned about this afterward, from Marco himself, in what she would later consider the only fully honest phone call they had during this period. Marco called on a Sunday evening, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who has been ashamed and decided to do something about it. "Someone came to see me," he said. "Man named Gerald Castillo. Said he was a financial advisor who specialized in family estate management, and he had concerns about the way you were handling things. Said he had reason to believe you were being given bad advice by attorneys who were charging excessive fees, and that the family had a legitimate interest in the estate management." Carla was quiet for a moment. "What did he want?" "He wanted me to provide documentation of your mental state during the time you were homeless." He used that word, documentation, like it was a normal thing to ask. "He wanted statements from me and Elena about your capacity to make financial decisions. He said he could help us establish that you needed family oversight in managing the estate. He wanted you to help him have me declared incompetent." Marco's silence was the answer. "What did you say?" "I told him no. I told him to leave. Then I called Elena and we compared notes because he went to her separately and said the same things. She told him no, too. He called twice more and we stopped answering." Carla absorbed this. "Thank you for telling me. I should have called you sooner. I wanted you to know." He paused. "Whoever this person is, Carla, he is organized. He knew things about our family that you would only know from research. He knew about the time you lived with us when Marisol was an infant. He knew about the medical bills. He knew about the shelter. He presented all of it as evidence that you were in distress and needed protection. She knew what to do with this information." She called Christine Bell that evening, and Christine Bell was not surprised, which was itself a kind of reassurance. "This is a pattern," Christine said. "With estates of this value, you get people who attempt to establish leverage through family members or through legal challenges to competency. The goal is usually settlement, getting you to pay someone to go away rather than spend money on litigation. Mr. Castillo, or whoever he is actually working for, is testing the approach. Can it work? If we let it develop, it could become disruptive. If we address it early and completely, it becomes a nuisance rather than a threat. Let me make some calls." What Christine Bell found, through the network of contacts that 30 years of estate law builds, was that Gerald Castillo had pursued similar strategies in 3 other estates over the previous decade, always targeting newly wealthy individuals who had been through financial difficulty, always using family members as the entry point, always making the approach seem like concern rather than extraction. In 2 of the 3 cases, his targets had paid him to go away. In the 3rd, he had been sued and had settled quietly. The pattern made him vulnerable. The documentation of his approach across multiple cases created a picture that no reasonable court was going to look at favorably. Christine Bell sent him a letter. It was 2 pages. Carla read a copy and thought that it was one of the most precise and devastating pieces of writing she had encountered, organized with the clarity of a closing argument and containing, in its final paragraph, a clear accounting of exactly what would happen if Gerald Castillo, or anyone working on his behalf, made further contact with Carla, her family members, or any of her legal representatives. He did not contact them again. Marisol, who had been following all of this with her notebook and her serious eyes, unwrote in her documentation on the evening the Castillo situation resolved. Day 41. The ones who tried to use our family could not. The family did not let them. Maybe that is what family is when it works. She showed the entry to Carla, who read it twice and said, "You might be right." The The spring deepened around them as the legal structure completed itself. The trust established and documented. The first assets prepared for sale, a selection of the numismatic collection that Christine Bell and Paul Okafor recommended as the most straightforward to liquidate. Gold and silver coins, whose provenance was cleanest and whose market was most liquid, a category Hector had specifically noted in the journal as appropriate for early sale if funds were needed. The auction was conducted by a firm in New York that specialized in numismatics, and it was not a large auction, not the full collection, just 47 pieces selected to establish market presence and generate operating capital. The total realized was $11.2 million, which arrived in the trust account on a Tuesday afternoon, and which Carla was informed about by a text message from Paul Okafor that read simply, "Funds received. All is in order." She was in the meadow when the text arrived, helping Marisol identify the first wildflowers of spring, small, pale yellow things pushing up through the last of the brown grass. She read the message and looked at the mountains and did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was something dramatic, a wave of relief or triumph, or the specific release of pressure that she had been carrying for so long it had become structural. What she felt instead was something quieter, a door that had been closed for a very long time, opening. Marisol looked up from the flower she was examining. "Good news?" "Good news," Carla said. Marisol went back to the flower. "Write it down," she said. Carla took out her phone and typed a note to herself. Day 44. Spring. The first of many. We are going to be okay. We are already okay. She had promised herself when they arrived that she would call Gloria from the shelter once things were settled enough to report. She called her that evening from the porch, the mountains turning the particular shade of blue-purple they became in the late light, the creek audible below. Gloria answered on the second ring. "You took long enough to call," she said, before Carla could say anything. "I know. Things have been complicated." "The news says complicated. The news says something about hundreds of millions of dollars. Is the news close?" "Close enough." Gloria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lord." "I know." "And Marisol? She is documenting everything in a notebook and identifying wildflowers, and she chose her own room for the first time in her life, and she is going to be fine." "And you?" "I am going to be fine too," Carla said. "I think I already am. I am still figuring out what that looks like." "Well," Gloria said, her voice warm and precise, "you are going to have plenty of time to figure it out now. That is the gift, you know? Not the money. The time." Carla held that for a moment, looking at the mountains. "Will you come see us?" she asked, "when things are more settled. Come to Montana, you and whoever you want to bring. I want to show you what Hector built." She heard Gloria's breath catch slightly. "That is the first thing you have asked for yourself since I have known you," she said. Carla smiled. "I am practicing." She went inside after the call, through the door with its quality lock and its carved mantel visible from the threshold, and she found Marisol in the kitchen, figuring out dinner with the focused self-sufficiency of a child who had been taking care of herself in small ways for a long time, and was now, gradually, being relieved of the necessity of doing so. They made soup together, an actual soup with vegetables from the store, and a broth from the package, and the wood stove holding its steady heat. They ate at the long table and talked about what Marisol wanted to do in the summer, whether there was a way to take riding lessons somewhere near Ridgemont, whether they could get a dog. A dog, Carla said. "I have been thinking about it for a long time," Marisol said. "I did not ask when we lived in the shelter because I knew it was not possible. But now it is possible. So we can?" "We can." Marisol wrote in her notebook. Day 44. Possibility of a dog confirmed. She showed it to Carla. Carla laughed, which was the sound of something restored. That night, after Marisol was asleep, Carla sat at the desk in the main room with the lamp on and Hector's journal open in front of her, not reading it this time, but looking at the physical evidence of 58 years of patient intention, the pencil marks and the ink marks and the occasional margin notations in different pen, the evidence of a man returning to his record over decades and adding to it, refining it, maintaining the document as carefully as he maintained the objects it described. She thought about what he had built, not just the vault, not just the collection, but the architecture of protection around it, the legal structures and the provenance chains and the documentation and the appraisers under confidentiality agreements and the attorneys in Helena waiting for the call. He had anticipated every obstacle. He had constructed against every threat. And then he had chosen her to receive it, not a professional, not someone with financial expertise, not someone positioned by education or connection to manage wealth, but a woman in a shelter who kept going. She understood now what he had seen. Not competence in the conventional sense, not skill or advantage, but the particular quality of a person who had been broken and refused to stay broken, who had been given every reason to give up and had not given up, who had maintained, in the worst conditions available, the ability to be kind and to try and to believe that the next thing might be better than the last one. He had decided that quality deserved a foundation. She looked around the room that had become home, the room with its fireplace and its carved instruction and its windows giving onto the mountain dark. And she thought about what she was going to build on the foundation Hector had given her. Not just security, not just comfort, though those were part of it. Something with the quality of purpose, the quality that Hector's own life had demonstrated, something that engaged with the world rather than simply insulating against it. She had ideas. They had been forming slowly over the weeks, in the quiet spaces between legal meetings and repair work, and the long evenings when the mountains outside were just dark shapes against a darker sky, and the fire was the only light, and she had the particular kind of thinking space that had been unavailable to her for 18 months of constant survival. She had ideas. They were not fully formed yet, but they were beginning. She closed the journal. She turned off the lamp. She climbed the stairs to her room, pausing at the door of Marisol's room to listen to the even breathing that meant her daughter was deeply, safely asleep in her own room, in her own house, in a place no one could take from them. She went to her own room and lay down and looked at the ceiling. And for the first time in longer than she could reliably remember, she fell asleep without running numbers. The morning after the first good sleep, Carla made a decision that she had been circling for weeks without quite landing on. She drove into Ridgemont and walked into Douglas Fenn's office without an appointment, climbing the stairs above the hardware store the way she had on the first day, though everything about how she climbed them was different now. Fenn looked up from his desk with the unhurried expression of a man who had time for unexpected visits. "Miss Reyes, how are things out at the bunkhouse?" "Things are very good," she said. "I came because I wanted to ask you something that I have been meaning to ask since the beginning." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Did Hector ever tell you what was in the vault?" Fenn was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He told me there were personal items. He was specific that they were not to be inventoried as part of the estate proceedings. He told me to give you the key and give you time and trust you to know what to do. Did you ever wonder?" Fenn smiled, the deep-lined smile of someone who had wondered about many things over a long career and had made peace with not knowing all of them. "Every time he came in," he said, "he was the most self-contained man I ever met. He gave away nothing about what he was thinking or planning. But once, maybe 5 years before he died, he came in to update some documents, and I asked him directly, whether he had concerns about leaving everything to someone he had never met. What did he say? He said, "The ones I have met have already shown me who they are. The one I have not met is the only honest choice." Carla sat with that for a moment. He was very clear-eyed about people, Fenn continued. He had been watching your family for a long time, and he understood them in the way that only distance gives you. He was not angry at them. He was just precise about what they were, and he was precise about what you were, which was different. She thanked him and drove back to the bunkhouse in the late morning, the mountains around Ridgemont sharp and clear under the high-altitude spring sky, the kind of blue that seemed to have been achieved by removing every impurity from the air. She thought about what Douglas Fenn had said. The ones I have met have already shown me who they are. Hector had watched her family fail her and had decided that her refusal to become what her circumstances might have made her was the most important thing about her. He had decided that a person who survived betrayal without being defined by it deserved better than what betrayal had given her. She had spent 18 months telling herself that story, trying to believe it, failing to believe it in the darkest hours, finding it again in the mornings when Marisol needed her to be someone worth following. Hector had believed it without qualification. He had believed it with $319 million. The meadow was fully green by the time she got home, the color having come in so gradually over the past weeks that she had not noticed it happening, until suddenly it was there, the whole field of it. And she stood for a moment outside the car, just looking at the shift from brown to green, which was the story of most things worth watching. Inside, Marisol was at the table with her notebook and a library book about geology, which she had requested from the Ridgemont Library because she had decided she wanted to understand the mountains, not just live near them, but know what they were made of and how they had become what they were. She looked up when Carla came in. "I found something in the book," she said, "about how mountains are formed. Did you know they grow so slowly you cannot see it happening? But over millions of years they become something that changes everything around them." Carla hung her coat on the hook by the door. "I did not know that," she said. Marisol looked back at the book. "I think that is kind of like what Hector did," she said. "He built something so slowly you could not see it happening. And then it became something that changed everything." Carla crossed the room and sat down across from her daughter and looked at her. This child who had survived what she had survived and come out the other side still curious, still reaching toward understanding, still finding the patterns in things and naming them. "I think you are exactly right," she said. Marisol wrote something in her notebook. She turned it so Carla could see. She had written in the careful letters she used for the things she wanted to keep. "What is built with patience, the storm does not undo." The same words carved in the mantel above the fireplace. Hector's words, now Marisol's too, handed across the generations through stone and ink. "That is it," Carla said. "That is exactly it." Outside the mountains held their ancient, patient weight against the sky. The same mountains Hector had looked at every morning for 60 years, building something the storm could not undo, waiting for the right person to find it, and having found it at last, in a woman who had been in a shelter when the letter arrived, and who had answered the phone and said yes. The summer arrived in Montana, the way summer arrives in high places, not gradually but suddenly, as though the season had been waiting just beyond the tree line, and one morning decided to walk in. The meadow around the bunkhouse went from tentative green to full, deep green in what seemed like a week, and the creek that had been running fast and cold with snowmelt settled into a steadier voice, and the mountains lost their white caps and showed the gray and brown of their upper rock, and Marisol, who had been documenting the changes in her notebook since the first day of spring, wrote on the morning of the summer solstice, "Everything here happens at its own pace and does not ask permission." She was 9 years old, and she had been writing things like that for 3 months. Observations that arrived in her notebook with the precision of someone who had been paying very close attention to the world for a long time and had only recently been given enough stillness to write them down. Carla read the entry over her daughter's shoulder and felt the particular quality of pride that came not from anything she had done, but from witnessing someone becoming themselves. "That is a good one," she said. Marisol considered it. "I think Hector would have liked it. I think he would have loved it." The summer brought visible change to the bunkhouse alongside the changes to the land. The roof was fully repaired now, not just the emergency patch of the first weeks, but a proper restoration. The standing seam metal cleaned and sealed and reinforced where age had weakened the joints. The porch had been rebuilt from new timber. The replacement boards matched carefully to the originals, the railing recarved by a craftsman from Ridgemont named Dale Whitmore, who had done carpentry in the mountains for 40 years, and who, when Carla explained what she was trying to preserve, had taken the work with a seriousness that told her he understood. The interior had been transformed more slowly and with more deliberation. Carla had not wanted to erase Hector. I had been careful to preserve what he had made while making the space livable for a woman and a child, rather than the solitary man who had occupied it for 60 years. The handmade furniture remained. The shelves remained. The carved mantel remained at the center of everything. What had been added was warmth, the particular warmth of a space that was being lived in rather than merely inhabited, the accumulated evidence of daily life that turns a structure into a home. Marisol's drawings covered the wall of her room now, 23 of them, and she had begun adding to the collection things she found on walks through the property. A bird feather mounted on a piece of bark, a small stone with an unusual crystalline inclusion that she had been researching in her geology book, and a pressed wildflower from the meadow that she had identified as a species specific to high-altitude Montana grassland and had documented with the location and date of finding in the manner Hector had used for his acquisitions. She had inherited his instinct for documentation without knowing him. The thought landed in Carla quietly one afternoon and stayed with her. The idea that certain qualities skipped generations and reappeared in unexpected places, that Hector had looked down the family line and seen something in Carla that he recognized from himself and had decided that was worth preserving. The legal work was not finished. Legal work of this complexity was never finished quickly, and Christine Bell had been clear from the beginning that they were operating on a timeline measured in years rather than months. But the structural elements were in place, the trust secure, the assets documented and categorized, the first liquidations complete, and the proceeds properly managed. Paul Okafor had filed everything correctly and on time, and the tax liability, while significant, was exactly what had been projected. No surprises in either direction. The art authentication had progressed through the summer. Renata Voss returned twice with additional specialists, and the fourth painting, the one acquired for $300 at an estate sale in Billings in 1973, completed its authentication process in July. 2 independent experts confirmed Renata's assessment. The work was genuine. It filled one of the 3 gaps in the known catalog, and the auction estimate came in at $21 million at the conservative end, 26 at the upper. When Christine Bell called with the authentication confirmation, Carla was in the vegetable garden she had started in June on the south side of the bunkhouse, in soil that turned out to be good, well composted and deep, the kind of soil that had been building itself for decades without anyone taking from it. 21 to 26 million, Carla said, kneeling in the dirt with her phone to her ear. For something Hector paid $300 for. He paid $300 and 60 years of patience, Christine said. That is a reasonable characterization. What would you like to do with it? Carla looked at the garden, at the rows of things she had planted, and was watching grow. She thought about what she had been thinking about all summer, the ideas that had been forming in the quiet spaces, the purpose that was clarifying itself slowly, the way the mountains clarified themselves through cloud on an uncertain day. "I want to keep it," she said. "I do not want to sell it. I want to find it a permanent home where people can see it. There are institutions that would be very interested in that conversation." "I know. Let me think about which one is right." She had been thinking about more than the painting. She had been thinking about the shelter in San Antonio, about Gloria, about the 40 women and children cycling through that space when she had been one of them, about the particular quality of desperation that was not weakness but circumstance, and about how thin the line was between circumstance and outcome, how much a single intervention at the right moment could alter the trajectory of a life. She had been thinking about what Hector had given her, which was not just money, but time and stability, and the removal of the grinding, constant pressure of not having enough, and about how that removal had made possible the clear thinking and the careful decisions and the sleep and the capacity to be fully present for Marisol that had been impossible when survival was the only available priority. She had been thinking about how many women were in shelters right now who were doing exactly what she had done, running numbers that did not add up, maintaining hope in conditions that made hope difficult, protecting their children with a ferocity that the circumstances around them did not reflect. She had been thinking about what she wanted to build on Hector's foundation. In August, she drove to Helena and had a meeting that was not with Christine Bell or Paul Okafor, but with a woman named Sylvia Morales, who ran a non-profit organization that provided transitional housing and legal support for women and children fleeing domestic violence. Sylvia had heard about the Bunkhouse story from the news coverage and had written Carla a letter, a careful letter that did not ask for anything, that simply introduced herself and her work, and said that if Carla was ever inclined to talk about the intersection of sudden wealth and the experience of having been without it, she was available. Carla had kept the letter on the table in the main room for 3 weeks before calling. Sylvia was 57, compact and precise, with the particular energy of someone who had been doing demanding work for a long time and had found in it not exhaustion, but fuel. She met Carla at a coffee shop near her office, and they talked for 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, Carla felt the ideas that had been forming all summer arrive at something like definition. "I want to build something," she told Sylvia. "Not a donation, not a check. Something structural. Something that addresses the thing I needed most when I needed it, which was not just money, but stability and time and the removal of the immediate crisis so that I could think clearly enough to make good decisions. What would that look like? I am still working on it. But I think it starts with housing, not emergency shelter, which is important and needs to exist, but the next layer, the transition, the place you go after the emergency is over and before you are stable, when you still need support, but what you need is not a bed in a shared room, but your own space and time, and help navigating the systems that are supposed to help you." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "That is the gap," she said. "Everyone knows it is the gap. The funding is always for emergency services because emergencies are visible and transitional need is not. Women leave emergency shelter and go back to dangerous situations because there is nowhere else to go." "I know. I almost did. I had Marisol, which kept me from it. But I understood the pull. They talked for another hour after that. Sylvia did not ask for anything specific, and Carla did not commit to anything specific. And when they parted, they both understood that a conversation had begun that was going to continue. Driving back to the bunkhouse in the late afternoon, the sun behind her throwing long shadows across the road, Carla thought about Hector sitting alone in the mountains for 60 years and whether he had been lonely. She had thought about this before, and had never fully resolved it. His journal suggested a man who found the solitude generative rather than painful, who used it to build something that would outlast him, who chose the distance from the family as a condition for the work rather than an escape from life. But she thought there must have been moments. The long winter evenings when the snow was too deep for the road, and the radio was the only voice, and the vault below the floor held its patient dark. The mornings when the mountains were beautiful in ways that called for sharing, when you wanted to turn to someone and say, "Look at that." She thought he had made a choice that had costs and had accepted the costs because the alternative cost more. She understood that now in a way she had not before coming to the bunkhouse. Not the solitude. She was not built for solitude the way Hector had been. She needed Marisol and Gloria's phone calls, and Dale Whitmore's conversation on the porch while he worked on the railing, and Pat at the general store, who had started saving specific items she thought Carla might want. But the choice, the willingness to accept the cost of a decision that others called foolish because you could see what was on the other side of it. When she had answered a phone call from a Montana area code and driven 3 days to a bunkhouse everyone else thought was worthless. She had accepted the cost of her siblings' revision of history and her family's sudden interest, and Gerald Castillo's organized scheme, and the journalists, and the financial advisors, and all of it, because what was on the other side of it was Marisol in her own room, with her drawings on the wall, saying, "This is my room," and meaning it. Hector had understood the principle. He had built the demonstration of it. She was living in the middle of the demonstration. The funding conversation with Sylvia Morales developed over the fall into something concrete. Christine Bell brought in a nonprofit specialist named Andre Fontaine, who had structured charitable foundations for high-value estates, and together they built the architecture for what would eventually be named the Hector Dominguez Reyes Foundation. Its stated purpose, the provision of transitional housing and stabilization support for women and children in the period following emergency shelter placement. The foundation received its initial endowment from the proceeds of the first major art sale, the 3 authenticated works sold through an auction house in New York in October, which together realized $64 million. The 4th painting, the one Carla had decided to place rather than sell, went to the Montana Museum of Art in Helena on long-term loan with the provenance story attached, and the museum mounted a small exhibition around it, the documentation of Hector's acquisition and the authentication process and the painting itself, are now fully cataloged in the reference texts as a previously unknown work. The exhibition opening was the first public event Carla attended in her new circumstances. She drove to Helena with Marisol in the passenger seat, and Douglas Fenn and his wife meeting them at the museum entrance, and she walked through the room where the painting hung and looked at it in the proper light for the first time, framed and illuminated, and held at the exact angle and distance that made it most itself. It was a landscape, mountains and sky, and a river in the middle distance. The light in it, the specific quality of late afternoon in high country, the kind of light that made you feel the weight of the day ending and the possibility of what the evening might hold. Hector had looked at this painting for 46 years. He had bought it for $300 in billings and carried it home and put it on the wall of the vault where he could see it from his desk. He had known what it was. He had always known. The card beside it read, "On loan from the Carla and Marisol Reyes collection, courtesy of the Hector Dominguez Reyes Foundation." Marisol stood in front of it for a long time. "He looked at this every day," she said. "Every day he came down to the vault." What do you think he thought about when he looked at it? Carla considered the painting, the mountains, and the light. "I think he thought about what lasts," she said. "What is still here after everything else is gone." Marisol pulled out her notebook and drew a small sketch of the painting, not a copy, but an impression. the shapes of it, the feeling of it. No, she dated it at the bottom and wrote, "First public showing." It was always this good. Marco came to the bunkhouse in September. He called first this time, 3 days in advance, and when he arrived, he came without an agenda, or at least without a visible one, which was a different thing from not having one, but was also the only honest starting place. He drove a rental car up the gravel road, and Carla met him at the gate and opened it, and they looked at each other for a moment across the distance that 18 months of managed disappointment had built. He looked older. She thought she probably did too. She showed him the bunkhouse, the main room, the kitchen, the upstairs rooms, Marisol's room with its drawings and its found objects. He walked through it quietly, and she watched him taking it in, the quality of the space, and the care in everything Hector had built, and the care she had added to it. When they came back to the main room and sat at the long table, he was quiet for a long time. "He left you something real," Marco said finally. "He left me something extraordinary. I did not believe it was possible when you called. I want you to know that I understand now that my not believing it does not say anything about whether it was possible. It just says something about me." Carla looked at her brother, this man she had grown up alongside, who had been formed by the same family and the same deprivations and the same particular mixture of love and harm that their upbringing had produced, and who had become someone cautious and sometimes unkind, but who was sitting here now saying a true thing. "I know," she said. "I am not angry at you, Marco. I was. I am not anymore. The money helped with that. The stability helped with that," she said. "The money is part of the stability, but it is not the whole thing. The whole thing is not waking up every morning and spending the first hour figuring out how to survive the day. That is what changes you, not the number." He nodded. He looked at the fireplace, at the carved mantel. "What does that say?" she told him. He read it twice. Then he said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was someone worth knowing. We never knew him." "That is on us," Marco said. "That is on the family." The conversation that followed was not easy, but it was honest, which was rarer and more valuable. Marco talked about things he had not talked about before, about the years when their father was sick and the family dissolved under the pressure of it, about the money that disappeared, and the reasons he had told himself for taking what wasn't his, and the degree to which those reasons had eroded over time into something he recognized as what it was. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked, in the careful language of someone who understood the limits of what he had earned, whether there was a path forward. Carla told him that there was a path, but that it required consistency over time, rather than a single conversation. That she had learned in the hardest way available that people were what they did repeatedly, and not what they said in meaningful moments, and that she was willing to see what he did repeatedly from here on. He stayed 2 days. He fixed a section of fence on the property boundary that had been listing since before they arrived, work he did without being asked, just found the tools in the outbuilding and spent an afternoon on it. He cooked dinner the second night, the thing he had always done well, the skill their mother had given them both, that Marco had maintained, and Carla had mostly let go in the years of scarcity when elaborate cooking was not possible. When he left, he shook her hand at the gate, which was the right thing. Not a hug, not yet, but something with weight and intention. "I will call," he said. "I will answer," she said. Marisol watched from the porch as the rental car went down the road. She wrote in her notebook, "Uncle Marco fixed the fence." "That is all?" "Sometimes a thing speaks for itself," Marisol said. The foundation's first grants went out in November to 7 organizations in 5 states that provided transitional housing for women and children. Each grant was substantial enough to matter, not symbolic, but operational. the kind of funding that allowed an organization to expand capacity rather than simply maintain what already existed. Christine Bell had brought in a grants manager named Tomas Ibarra, whose job was to ensure the money did what it was intended to do and to track the outcomes with the same methodical care that Hector had applied to his acquisitions. Carla read every application personally. She sat at the long table in the main room, with the applications spread across the wood, and she read them with the particular attention of someone who recognized the landscape they described, who knew the language of women in crisis, not as an abstraction, but as a place she had lived. She could tell the difference between an organization that understood its clients and one that was providing services at a distance from the reality of those clients. The difference between help that met people where they were and help that required people to come to where the help decided to stand. She funded the ones that understood. She passed on the ones that did not, making notes that Tomas turned into feedback letters, constructive and specific, because the goal was not to grade organizations, but to improve them. Gloria called the week the first grants went out. She had heard from one of the organizations that received funding, a woman who ran a transitional program in Houston, who knew Gloria through the network of shelter directors that connected these institutions in the way that all work done in the same difficult territory eventually connects its workers. She told me, Gloria said. She told me who the foundation was named for and where it came from. She called me because she thought I might know you. You know me, Carla said. I know you. She paused, and Carla could hear in the pause the weight of 2 years of Gloria watching over the woman and child in her shelter, the careful maintenance of dignity that Gloria performed for everyone in her care, the small, consistent kindnesses that cost her nothing material and everything in terms of sustained attention. Carla, what you are doing, what you built, what Hector built, Carla said, what you both built, so Gloria said firmly. He built the vault. You built the foundation. Those are equal contributions in my accounting. Carla sat with that. She was in the kitchen when the call came, the winter light coming through the new windows at the angle it took in December, the wood stove steady, Marisol upstairs doing the homeschool mathematics that had become her particular interest this semester, working through problems with a focused pleasure that suggested she had found in numbers the same satisfaction her great-great-uncle had found in patient accumulation. I'm going to come see you, Carla said. In the spring. I want to come back to San Antonio, and I want to see the shelter, and I want to talk to Gloria about what they need. Gloria was quiet for a moment. We need a lot of things. Make me a list. A long pause. Wanda, you are going to make me cry, and I do not cry at work. Then wait until after work, Carla said. The winter in Montana was what Carla had been told it would be, and more. The snow came in November and kept coming, and the world outside the bunkhouse windows became a thing of extraordinary silence. The meadow buried, the creek muffled beneath ice, the mountains carrying their white weight against a sky that on clear days was a blue so deep it seemed almost violet. Dale Whitmore had stocked them with enough firewood for 2 winters and had walked Carla through every system in the building before the first serious snow. The hand pump insulated against freezing, the chimney cleaned and sealed, the solar panels angled correctly for the low winter sun. They were warm. They had food. They had the particular richness of a winter spent indoors in a good house, the way that being inside becomes its own landscape when the outside is extreme. Marisol made a project of the winter. She had found Hector's collection of books about the natural history of the region and was working through them systematically, keeping notes, building her own secondary document that was part summary and part response, her observations and questions, and the connections she was finding between what the book said and what she had seen on the property in the months they had been there. She wrote to the author of one of the books, a biologist at the University of Montana, who had published the study of mountain ecosystems that was Marisol's current main text, asking 3 specific questions about the relationship between snowpack depth and spring wildflower emergence that had occurred to her from her own documentation. The biologist wrote back. He wrote 2 pages, answering her questions directly, and then asking her 3 questions of his own about what she had observed at their specific elevation and aspect. He addressed the letter to Miss Carla Reyes, research correspondent, which Marisol found satisfying. She showed the letter to Carla. "He takes me seriously," she said. "You ask serious questions. I did not know adults would answer serious questions from children." "The good ones do," Carla said. "Hector would have." Marisol looked at the letter. "I wish I could have met him. Tell me what you would have asked him." Marisol thought about it for a moment, with the focused attention she brought to everything. "I would have asked him if he was lonely, not to be sad about it, just because I want to know if the things he built were enough company." Carla sat with the question. She had thought about this herself, had never fully resolved it, but she had come, over the months in his house, to a position on it. "I think the things he built were not company," she said. "I think the things he built were purpose. And I think purpose is different from company, but it is its own kind of fullness. He was a man who needed to make something that would last, and he made it. And every day he went down to the vault and saw what he had made and knew that it was real and that it would survive him. I think that was enough for him. And I do not think it would have been enough for you or me. But for him, yes." Marisol considered this and then wrote it in her notebook. Not the quote, but the idea, rendered in her own language. Purpose is its own fullness. Hector knew this. Mom knows it too now. The spring brought Gloria. She arrived in April, 3 months after Carla had promised to come to San Antonio. A reversal that had happened because Carla had called Gloria in February and said, "I want you to see what we built." And Gloria had said, "I have vacation days," and the conversation had proceeded from there. Gloria came with her daughter Esperanza, who was 19 and studying social work, and who was, from the moment she walked through the bunkhouse gate, in a state of barely managed amazement. They spent 5 days. So Gloria cooked in the bunkhouse kitchen with the authority of someone who had been cooking for 40 people at a time for 20 years and found cooking for 4 luxuriously restrained. She and Carla sat on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in blankets, watching the spring mountains, and talked in the way they had not quite been able to talk before, when the shelter had been their context, and Carla had been in crisis, and the conversation had been necessarily bounded by those facts. On the 3rd evening, Gloria said, "You know what I see when I look at this place?" "What?" "I see what happens when someone decides that a person in a shelter is worth something. Not worth helping. Worth something. Hector decided you were worth something, and he built this for you. And now you are building something for other women in shelters and deciding they are worth something. It is the same decision repeated." Carla looked at the mountains. "I think that is what he wanted," she said. "I think that is why he was so specific that it had to be me, someone who had needed it and would understand what it was for." The foundation by that spring had supported transitions for over 120 women and their children. Through the organizations it funded, each one now able to operate at a scale that the grants had made possible. Tomas tracked the outcomes with the specificity Carla had asked for, not just numbers of people served, but the specific changes in their trajectories, employment obtained, housing stabilized, legal situations resolved, children enrolled in consistent schools. The numbers were not dramatic in the way that headlines required drama, not thousands and not millions, but they were real. 123 women, 141 children, Lives that had been in the same kind of suspended crisis that Carla's had been in, held in place by the absence of a floor beneath them, now with a floor. 123 Carlas, she thought. 141 Marisols. In May, almost exactly 15 months after the phone call from Douglas Fenn, Carla held a gathering at the Bunkhouse. Not a party, not a celebration in the conventional sense, but something she had been planning since the winter, an occasion for the people who had been part of the story to be in the same place together. Douglas Fenn and his wife came, Christine Bell and Paul Okafor, Renata Voss, who had driven up from Missoula, where she was doing authentication work at another estate, Dale Whitmore, Pat from the general store, Sylvia Morales from Helena, Gloria and Esperanza, who had planned their return trip to coincide with the gathering, Marco, who had been calling once a week since September and had earned the invitation through consistency rather than relationship. Elena had not been invited, not because she was permanently excluded, but because she had not done the work that Marco had done, had not called, had sent a card at Christmas with a gift card inside that was too large to be anything other than a gesture and too small to be anything other than a statement. And Carla had sent a thank you note and waited to see what came next, which so far had been silence. The door was not closed. It was just not open yet. They gathered in the meadow because the day was warm and the mountains were showing their full summer presence, and the creek was running bright, and the bunkhouse sat at the edge of all of it, looking like what it was, a thing built with patience that the storm had not undone. Carla had set up tables from the bunkhouse kitchen, food she had made, and food people had brought, and the gathering had the texture of an occasion that did not quite have a name, something between a housewarming and a memorial and a celebration of survival. Marisol had made something for the occasion. She had been working on it for 2 weeks without telling Carla what it was, using the desk in her room with the door closed, and she presented it that afternoon. A book. Handmade, the pages sewn together, was the cover of heavy paper with the bunkhouse drawn on the front and the mountains behind it. Inside, in her precise, small handwriting, the story of the 15 months since the phone call. Every significant thing documented, the shelter, and the drive, and the arrival, and the key, and the vault, and the journal, and the legal battles, and the family, and the foundation. Written in the careful neutral language of documentation, and also, in the margins, in a smaller hand, the observations, and the feelings, and the things that the formal record did not capture. She had made 2 copies, one for the bunkhouse, one for the Foundation's archive, so that the people who applied for and received grants would be able to read, if they chose to, the story of where the money came from and what it was meant to carry forward. Such Carla held the book in both hands and looked at her daughter and felt the specific quality of a moment that was complete in itself, not a step towards something else, but a thing that was fully what it was. "You made this," she said. "For the record," Marisol said. "Like Hector." Like Hector, Carla agreed. The gathering moved through the afternoon in the easy way of occasions that have found their right rhythm. Douglas Fenn sat with Marco and told him stories about Hector that Marco absorbed with the specific hunger of someone trying to know someone they would never meet. Christine Bell and Sylvia Morales talked for 2 hours in a corner of the meadow about the structure of the foundation and where it should go next. Dale Whitmore showed Gloria the sections of the bunkhouse he had worked on, and she ran her hand along the porch railing and said, "And someone who cared built this," meaning both Hector and Dale said, "Yes, ma'am," and that was sufficient. Marisol and Esperanza walked the property together, and Carla watched them from the porch, the 19-year-old and the 9-year-old moving through the meadow grass toward the creek, Marisol explaining something about the geology of the slope above the tree line, pointing toward the upper ridge, where the rock changed character, and Esperanza listening with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested. Tomas had sent a report that morning. The foundation had received its first unsolicited application from an organization in Montana, a transitional housing program in Missoula that served women and children from rural communities who had no existing infrastructure near them. The application was strong. The program model was sound, and it would bring what the foundation was doing into the state that had given Carla and Marisol their foundation. She had approved it before the gathering began. In the late afternoon, when the light was doing what Montana light did at that hour, going golden and long and specific, in the way that made everything it touched look like it had been painted with the intention of lasting, Carla walked to the vault. She went alone. She went down the stone stairs with the flashlight she kept on the hook at the top, and she stood in the chamber that Hector had built over 60 years, the shelves now partially emptied by the authentication and sale processes, but still holding the bulk of what he had accumulated. The coins in their cases, the bullion on its shelves, the remaining paintings wrapped in their archival covers, the scientific instruments in their glass-fronted cabinets, the desk in the center with his journal still on it. She stood in the cool underground dark, and she thought about him, this man she had never met, who had been in this room thousands of times, who had come down these stairs in all weathers and all seasons for 60 years, and stood in front of his work and known that he was building something worth building. She thought about what he had decided and why he had decided it. She thought about the quality of attention required to watch a family from a distance for decades and accurately identify the one person in it who was worth trusting with everything he had made. She thought about what it meant to be seen that clearly by someone who would never speak to you. She felt, standing in the vault, that she owed him something that could not be paid with money or named in a legal document, something that could only be paid by doing what he had hoped she would do, by taking the gift and building it outward into the world in the direction of the people who needed it most. She thought she was doing that. She thought she was going to keep doing it. She picked up the journal from the desk and held it for a moment, the leather worn smooth in the way of things handled over many years with care. And she thought of all the hands that had ever held it, only one pair before hers, old hands that had written in this book for 58 years, and then laid it down and closed the vault and gone upstairs to wait for whoever was coming. She put the journal back exactly where it had been. She climbed the stairs and closed the stone section behind her and went back out through the main room to the porch, where the gathering was still going in the meadow below, and the mountains were doing what they always did at this hour, going purple in the middle distance and blue at the far range, and then a darkness that was not quite darkness against the sky. Marisol came up the steps from the meadow and stood beside her. "Are you okay?" "I am very okay. You were down there." "Yes. I go sometimes, too," Marisol said, "when I want to think about him." "What do you think about?" She leaned against her mother's arm. "I think about how he was alone for a long time, and then he made something so that the people who came after him would not have to be." She paused. "I think that is what love looks like when you do not know the person yet. You build something for them anyway." Carla put her arm around her daughter and held her against her side, this small, sturdy person who had survived what she had survived and come out the other side, with her heart intact and her eyes open and her notebook full of the evidence of paying close attention to the world. "I think you are right," she said. "I think that is exactly what it is." They stood on the porch in the late light and looked at the gathering in the meadow below them, the people who had been part of this story, all of them brought here by a chain of events that had started with a phone call to a woman in a shelter who had answered because her daughter was watching, and she did not want her to see her flinch. Hector had spent 60 years building this. Carla had spent 15 months finding it. And now, in the foundation and the grants, and the 123 women, and the 141 children, and the programs in 7 states, and the painting in the Helena Museum, and Marisol's handmade book in the Foundation's archive, it was growing outward in the way that things built with patience grow, slowly, steadily, in ways you could not see happening, but that, over time, became something that changed everything around them. The mountains held their ancient weight against the evening sky. The creek ran over its stones. The bunkhouse stood where it had stood for 60 years, solid and certain, its carved mantel visible through the open door, the words in the wood that Hector had put there for whoever came after him. Lo que se construye con paciencia, no lo deshace la tormenta. What is built with patience, the storm does not undo. They had found that to be true. They intended to keep proving it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story. There is a moment when you have come through something that should have broken you and did not, when the life you thought you had lost turns out to have been replaced by something larger than you knew how to ask for. A moment when you stand on a porch in Montana and look at mountains and feel the particular quality of an ending that is also a beginning, and you understand that the path that led here was not a detour from your life, but the actual shape of it. Carla understood that now. She had spent 2 years believing she was at the end of something. The job, the apartment, the savings, the family that dissolved when the pressure was applied, the father she had lost too soon, the months in the car, and then the shelter, the math that never added up. She had believed she was at the end of something, and she had been wrong. She had been at the beginning of this, of the bunkhouse, and the vault, and the foundation, and Marisol's drawings on the wall, and the biologist who wrote back, and Dale Whitmore, who carved the railing, and Pat, who saved things she thought Carla might want, and Gloria, who said you are worth something, and Hector, who had built 60 years of proof that she was. You do not know, when you are in the worst of it, that the worst of it is also the approach to something else. You cannot know. The angle of vision from inside the crisis does not permit that kind of foresight. What you can do, what Carla had done, and what Hector had watched her do from his careful distance, is keep going. Keep trying. Keep being the kind of person who gives without keeping score, who carries what she is given without putting it down, who maintains enough hope to answer the phone when an unfamiliar Montana number calls. The rest follows from that. Not always, not for everyone. The world is not that just, and Carla was under no illusion that her story was reproducible by will alone. She had been found by someone who had been looking for her. She had been chosen by a man who had the resources and the foresight and the love, though he would not have used that word, to build something for someone he had never met. But she thought about the foundation and the 123 women and the 141 children, and she thought, even if it is not always, let it be more often. Let the gap narrow between the people who need a foundation and the people who have one. Let the work that Hector started and that she was carrying forward become part of the world in a way that outlasted both of them. That was what she was building. Not just security for herself and Marisol, though that was real and important and the first condition of everything else. But something with the durability of what Hector had built, something that required patience and intention and the willingness to work in ways that did not produce immediate visible results, something that would be here long after she was gone. Marisol understood this, and she was 9 years old, and she was already keeping the record, already making the book, already writing to biologists and documenting wildflowers and thinking about what her great-great-uncle had built, and why, and what it meant for what she would build when it was her turn. Carla thought Hector would have found that satisfying. She thought that was what he had been hoping for when he looked at the family from a distance and chose the one who he believed would not just receive the gift, but extend it. She thought she was extending it. She thought she was going to keep extending it for a long time. The evening settled around the bunkhouse, the gathering in the meadow breaking up slowly as the temperature fell. People collecting their things, saying their goodbyes with the warmth of a good afternoon well spent, and making their way to cars and back down the gravel road toward Ridgemont, and then onward to wherever they had come from. The mountains went dark by degrees. The creek kept its voice in the new quiet. The first stars appeared above the eastern ridge, the ones that always came first, before the sky was fully dark. Douglas Fenn paused at the gate on his way out and looked back at the bunkhouse. He would have liked today, he said to Carla, who was standing nearby. Yes, she said. He would have. You know what I think he wanted most? What? For it to be useful. Not impressive, not valuable in the abstract sense, but useful to actual people. He was a practical man under everything else. He wanted the thing he built to do something. It is doing something, Carla said. Fenn nodded. Yes, it is. He went through the gate and down the road, his tail lights rounding the bend and disappearing into the trees. Carla latched the gate and stood in the last light. Behind her, the bunkhouse held its warmth. Marisol inside now, the lamp in her room visible through the window, probably writing in her notebook, probably documenting the day with the methodical care she brought to everything worth keeping. Ahead of her, the mountains stood in their silence, patient and enormous, indifferent to everything human in the way that only very large and very old things can be indifferent, not unkind, just beyond the scale of individual concern, operating on timelines that made 60 years of a man's life look like an afternoon. Hector had understood that too, had lived with it daily, had let it shape him into someone who thought in decades rather than quarters, who planned for people not yet born, who built against the storm with the certainty that the storm was always coming and that what you built with patience was the only appropriate response. Carla walked back to the bunkhouse. She went up the porch steps, across the boards that Dale had made right, through the door that opened onto the carved mantel and the stone fireplace and the long table and the shelves and the windows looking out at the dark. She checked on Marisol. She was at her desk, writing, her lamp making a warm circle in the room that she had chosen, and that was hers. Good night, baby. Good night, Mom. She went to her own room and lay down in the dark and listened to the mountain quiet, which was not silence, but the layered sound of everything alive out there in the dark. The creek and the wind in the pines, and somewhere far up the slope, something moving through the underbrush, the world going on in all its complex, patient aliveness without requiring anything from her. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about the foundation and the work ahead, and the conversations she still needed to have, and the decisions that were still being made, and all of it was real and present and hers to navigate. But tonight, she let it rest. Tonight, she lay in the house that Hector built and felt the weight of what he had given her, not just the money and not just the security, but the proof that someone had looked at her clearly and decided she was worth everything. That was the gift. That was the real thing in the vault, not the gold, not the paintings, not the coins in their velvet cases, or the bullion on its shelves. No, the real thing was the decision, the 60-year act of faith that said, I believe someone is coming who deserves this, and I will build it for them, and wait. She had come. She had been worthy of the wait, or she was trying to be, which was the same thing. She fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the wind and the mountains doing their slow, patient work, and she slept without running numbers. And in the morning, there would be more to do, and she would do it. And for now, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.